Hey friends, welcome back to the Serenity Project. Once again, my name is Rebecca and I'm here recovering from an eating disorder.
And I am a recovering alcoholic and my name is Lana. I am also recovering from an eating disorder as well.
Nice. And so today we're going to talk about something that's really near and dear to me, and I wrote a big research paper on it a couple years back, so I'm quite passionate about it, and that is weight stigma in eating disorder treatment. We both have personal experience with this. And so we're going to talk a bit about the research first quickly to get you up to speed, and then we're going to go into our own experiences.
Take it away, Becca.
Okay, so anorexia is defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is where they diagnose mental disorders, is defined with a weight criteria. So you have to have the obsession and preoccupation with food and the weight and shape concerns, but you also need to be underweight. And this is a huge problem because it obscures all the research around what gets someone well. And a lot of that is focused around weight restoration, and that's a huge part of treatment, as I'm sure was your experience, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who have gone through the system multiple times, and as soon as their weight restored, they're booted from treatment, even though they have no other results. Okay. This is the part we cut out. When I look at the notes. The APA even says that the most important factors for doctors to consider for treatment is someone's weight and their cardiac and metabolic function. I find this really frustrating because actually 11 to 36% of are not otherwise specified actually have BMI starting in the overweight or obese range. So if you take someone who's 5'2" and maybe 160 pounds and they lose 30% of their body weight, maybe they're at a normal weight range, but they've starved themselves down a third of their body weight. Now, if you start with someone who's slimmer to begin with, it's going to look problematic right away. And I think there's a huge stigma, what's the word I'm looking for? Bias around what an eating disorder looks like.
Yeah.
So it's like if someone has an eating disorder, they're either skeletal or maybe they're obese, but there's no really in between, and often the people who get the help they need are the people who are malnourished and dying.
You can be overweight and malnourished, by the way.
Yeah, which is exactly the point I'm coming to next. So I'm sure you may have heard of the Minnesota starvation study, where they took conscientious objectors to war and they brought them in, basically starved them. They said, how are we going to refeed people after the Holocaust? Like, what's this going to look like on their body? And they starved these men down to skin and bones, and they found that these men started hoarding food, obsessing about food and their weight and when they're going to eat, what they're going to eat, looking at recipes all day, like very typical symptoms of anorexia and a lot of other eating disorders. And they found that for most, if not all of them, when they were able to eat and become weight restored, that these symptoms went away. So they basically reasoned backwards and said, oh, okay, if that's making their symptoms go away, then that'll work in treating anorexia. But where this falls short is if you're someone who has atypical anorexia, meaning you have all the symptoms of anorexia, but you don't have the underweight body, then this reasoning is false, because you do not need to weight restore them because they're not underweight. So if that's the answer to treating it, then how do you treat these people? And the answer is they just fucking don't. It's like, you're not getting treatment, you're not a priority to us, you're not in our treatment manuals for how to work with you.
We don't know what to do, essentially.
Yeah, it's like no one's trained them, and all the studies, in order to get funding, need to follow DSM guidelines. So if you want your study funded and if you want it approved, then you're following anorexia definitions where anorexia has an underweight criteria. So your population, if you're someone who has restrictive or purging or anorexic behaviors and you're overweight, you're not studied. And so all the research too, like the results, confound that as a variable, because all they look at is how people have gained weight and how things have improved. Now, in my research, I looked at a bunch of different studies where people went through refeeding and they had their overall eating disorder scores improved and their fear around food and eating, etc. A lot of improvement there, but no or little improvement in terms of self-esteem and being comfortable with your shape or drive for thinness. And these are the factors which often land people in treatment in the first place. Like it's a multifaceted disease, right? And so I believe that everything needs to be looked at and not just that. And so the last thing I want to touch on, and sorry I could rant about this all day, but is that a good outcome, according to the American Psychiatric Association, from anorexia is maintaining a normal body weight and having a return of your period. Now I'm going to get into my experience in a little bit, but that is not a good outcome because a lot of the research shows that the people can have a normal body weight but have actually just moved on to binging and purging, and that's why their body weight is normal. So maybe they're not meeting criteria for anorexia because they're not underweight, but they now just have another eating disorder. And that was exactly my experience. But anyways, I'm going to pass it over to Lana to share hers so I can shut up for a bit and you guys can listen to her experience.
I was 13 when my eating disorder really took hold, and I had kind of explained in a different video what my eating disorder stemmed from, but it was due to a sexual assault. And during the sexual assault, that man had said something to me about the shape of my body and the fact that I was going through puberty, and that comment stuck with me. So basically I just wanted my body to stop changing, and the only way I knew how to do that was through nutritional deficit, and so that's what I did. And it started with restricting severely and then went into over exercising and obsessive thoughts regarding what I was doing with food. So I dropped a significant amount of weight within 3 to 4 months, and I got down to 68 pounds, which for my height, I was 5'7", and that's a dangerous place to be. So they hospitalized me. During this time, they had to make sure that my heart was going to be able to survive and that my organs were doing what they needed to do, which they weren't. They got me to a place where I was stable, but because I was so underweight and because I still had all of these issues that could come up very quickly, no treatment wanted to take me. I was an insurance liability. Essentially, they were saying, like, you could die in our care and we really don't want a lawsuit. And this was a huge barrier. So eventually a treatment center did take a risk on me and said, okay, come. And I started the refeeding process. Now the problem with that was there was a lot of high calorie, high carb, high fat food that was served to me, and I still had a G-tube at this time. So they were pumping me full of Ensure and nutritional milk, but they were also having me eat calories. And during that process, they weren't teaching me about healthy choices, and they weren't teaching me about cooking. So at 13 years old, they could have made me a blank slate and said, this is how you cook, this is how you prepare healthy meals, and this is what you should be looking for going forward. Also, this is how you exercise healthily. Like, this is a good amount of exercise to be doing if you eat this meal, or just exercising to have a healthy mind, not to be burning calories. None of that was incorporated. They basically got me to a weight. They had a number in my chart that they got me to, and that was it. And they said, okay, you're good, you can go home. I didn't have follow-up support with a nutritionist, a therapist, any of that, and I found that very difficult because then I went into, once again, over-exercising to make up for the fact that I was once again eating. Given the fact that I was shooting vodka into my digestive tract at this point, I was consuming a lot of calories. So I did have to over-exercise to help with that consumption. And I also started purging orally through this at this time because I didn't know how to deal with the fact that I was now what I considered fat. The doctors considered me healthy, but I had no muscle tone really because I had laid around for 6 months in a treatment center. They didn't let me do anything. They kept me very sedentary, and that's just how it was. I was very sick coming out. I never really got too much into binging per se. It was more just purging my calories and purging what I could, and the obsessive thoughts, which is just as dangerous as whatever, right?
It's an equal insanity.
Yeah, so I basically, like, I think I pretty much have summed up what my experience with it was. And then when I went to treatment later on for alcoholism, they started noticing my weird food behaviors again. Like, the counselor started noticing. But it was never really addressed in a way that I could get help with, until I started being honest this year about the fact that I was purging normal sized meals again. My electrolytes were really messed up. My heart was doing funny things. It's still doing funny things. And the doctor at Toronto, Jen, said, we want you to come in and live on our inpatient treatment program, because your stats, even though you're at a healthy weight, your stats are not doing the greatest. Now, the problem for me there was that I was in a place where I compared myself to people that were sick. I said, I am not underweight. I don't have a lot of these issues. I don't look sick. People are going to judge me if I go to this program. I also, and that is a stigma, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also in the eating disorder culture or community, I feel we're very competitive with each other.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And it's kind of sick, but
it's very sick.
But it is what it is. And I ended up not following through with this just because of the treatment I received from this physician as well, and I haven't really followed up with her. But I was not treated with dignity and respect and care that I would have expected I should have been treated with. So because I felt like I was healthy, and because of this treatment, I'm now in a place where I have my behaviors under control, but it could have went a completely different, destructive way. So if you're watching, doctor, thank you for that. Appreciate you.
Yeah, and my experience was very similar in a lot of ways, right? So I had anorexia. That's where it started with me. It started more so as a kid, but the first time it got really severe, I was in second year university, and I lost around 25 pounds pretty quickly. And I was never overweight to begin with, so like the cases I was talking about, it was very apparent. I was very thin. And I had the same perception a lot of people in medicine do. And I thought that if I just eat and eat and eat and gain back all the weight, that this mental obsession will just go away.
Yeah.
It's exactly what they say. It's exactly what they do in treatment. And so I ate and ate and ate, and I binge ate all day. And when I got to my goal weight, I panicked and I thought, okay, I'm here. Now why can't I stop this behavior? And so I started over exercising as a way to purge, and I would binge multiple times a day and go to the gym for hours. And eventually I started purging by Boston Treatment Center. So when I went to my first treatment center, I actually wasn't requiring weight restoration. I just went for bulimia and binging and purging. I did not find the treatment helpful, but I went because I was incredibly suicidal at the point. So I just needed some sort of intervention to keep me safe, and it did do that, but the symptoms came back quite quickly. My second inpatient treatment center, I also went for bulimia, but I had lost all the weight again. I purged everything. It wasn't just binges, it was everything I put in my mouth came out. And that got me really sick really quickly. And when I went there, what the doctors do and the dietitian do is they say, okay, you're 5'2", you're a female, this is a good weight range for you. But it's not a range. They choose a BMI of 20 is essentially what they do for people. And when you get towards that weight, they start pulling back food. So they add extra supplements like Ensures and Boosts and extra snacks and add-ons at meals. And as soon as you start approaching that bare minimum, they take away the food. Now, what that said to me was that if I go over that weight, then I'm going to be fat, and that was bad because all these medical professionals are now trying to keep me at a BMI of 20, not 20.5, not 21, and not lower. And there was a lot of fear. There's also a lot of fear on like, oh, now I'm used to eating these huge amounts of food, and now you want me to eat half of that? Like when you're on like a 5,000 calorie a day diet, for months your body adjusts to that intake of food, which can be really challenging. In our community, there's something known as the overshoot phenomenon, which is basically like you do your refeeding and then you overshoot your pre-eating disorder weight, right? So for an example, if I started at 110 and then I go down to 80 pounds, when I go through that refeeding process, it's very normal and very common to overshoot that 110, maybe by 5, 10, even 20 pounds. Everyone has a different experience. And this is something they do not talk about. They do not tell you about it. It's like, but if you Google it, and you can read tons of forums, trust me, I did, because I couldn't figure out what was happening, and that was really stressful. And this is something that causes a lot of people in their recovery to start purging. Like that's why 40% of people in recovery from anorexia actually meet criteria for bulimia. So maybe you have a return of your period like I did, and all these things are improving, and you're eating food and you look normal and you're a normal body weight, but really you have like just another equally horrible like mental plague. Right? So I think like tagging onto that, like the fact that they set weight targets, like minimum weight targets, is harmful and just perpetuates that fear that people with eating disorders already have. It's like, oh, if I'm anything above that, then I've failed in some way, or I'm abnormal or an anomaly, and maybe this treatment thing's not for me. And I think it's very upsetting to me how this is just blatantly ignored by the medical community, and that something more isn't done about it. And so our hope in making this video is that if you are someone with an eating disorder and you have experienced weight stigma or stigma and issues in getting into treatment or getting therapy, or even with your doctor, just being willing to get you any help for an eating disorder, or know anyone who has, please share this video, give us a like, subscribe, comment, tell us your experience. I'd love to hear from you. I'd also love and be happy to send anyone the paper I wrote who wants to read it.
I also want to touch on the fact that in my late 20s, I started taking responsibility for my eating disorder recovery. In the past, I had really thought it was my doctor's responsibility, or my medical team, or all of my parents, whoever. I thought it was their responsibility to find me what was going to work for me. And I used that as a means to stay sick, to stay resentful, to stay hateful, and all of those things. And eventually I realized that it wasn't doing me any good. It was also fueling my alcoholism. And I was tired of being sick. So I started advocating for myself, and I started being incredibly honest, which was really hard for me to do. But that honesty piece, people do not know how to help you unless you tell them the truth. And the truth may be difficult to get out, but once it is out, in my experience, I have found that people will go to the end of the earth to try to find a solution for you, minus that doctor I had just told you about. But I had a medical team of people who I went and said, this was my experience with this doctor, and they gave me a great support and said, okay, we'll find something else that works, right? It didn't just stop, and I wasn't thrown to the wolves. But that's on me. And I mean, everybody has a different level of where they're at, and somebody who's really sick may not be able to do it, but by saying this, I hope that I give you the courage and the faith and the hope to do it for yourself, to change your mindset and the way that your brain is wired right now, to just have a little glimmer outside of the illness, because there's two voices that go on inside of our head, really. And if you just have a brief moment where you can say, yes, I'm going to advocate for myself, then do it. And if you need help, we are here, just like Becca said.
Yeah, and the research is out there too. Like, they're misinformed and they need to be informed. So don't be afraid to speak up, because really it is like, it's not going to change unless people talk about it. And I know this is a really common experience. Every woman I've spoken to with an eating disorder has experienced what we've just covered in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So definitely be an advocate for yourself.
You are allowed to question your doctors. Yeah, we're all still learning and growing. They're human too.
Yeah, some of them.
Ah.
Anyways, see you next week.
Peace.